نعمل شيرنج بالأول. طيب احنا we are still talking about antibacterials, but we will start, let's say, we will continue with those which are considered antibiotics, or in other words, those which are derived from natural sources, or the precursor for them is derived from, let's say, natural sources. هلا الانتيبيوتكس باي ذا واي مش كلمه فقط تنطبق على those which are or have antibacterial effect. يعني حتى الانتي نيوبلاستكس اللي they are derived from nature, they are called, let's say, antibiotic chemotherapy, all right, أو antibiotic antineoplastics. Now, يعني زي ما احنا ماشيين أو كنا ماشيين من بداية الفصل للآن، احنا the drug classes that we are, let's say, considering, their classification and sub-classification is based on their mechanism of action. The first antibiotics اللي راح نحكي عنهم are those which are inhibitors of cell wall synthesis. هلا before we go into the structure of this drug class اللي هم البيتا لاكتامز واللي we will spend a lot of time explaining them, we need to look at the cell wall structure. Some characteristics راح تهمنا كثير لأنه later on لما احنا بدنا نناقش السار of the beta lactams راح نحكي أو penicillins in particular راح نحكي عن ال structural modifications that led, for instance, to broadening the spectrum of activity اللي هي كانت اعتمادا على انه الدرج يدخل من ال porins of the outer cell membrane للgram negative bacteria. فبالنهاية we need, let's say, to understand or know what we mean by outer membrane, البورنز، السيل وول structure، ايش هي الانزيمز involved and all that. فرح تكون بداية هاي المحاضرة an introduction about the cell wall structure, cell wall synthesis, the building blocks of this structure، واللي على أساسه later on رح نحكي عن ال structure of penicillins and how they actually bind to those enzymes and inhibit them. هلا أنا already uploaded على ال e-learning a very nice animation للcell wall structure. فيعني الانيميشن بيغنيكم بشكل كبير عن خلينا نحكي الفيجرز اللي احيانا ما بتكون very nicely representing those 3D structures. ف I highly recommend انكم تشوفوا those videos. Okay. طيب هلا في البداية you all know that bacteria to protect itself from the environment, from host enzymes, from, let's say, changes بالosmotic pressure and so on. That is why besides the cell membrane that contains everything inside it, it is surrounded by a cell wall. Okay? A cell wall is a very nice structured framework of a polymer that is synthesized inside the cell وخلينا نحكي pieced together outside of the cell. Okay? هلا ال cell wall, ال variation بالstructure in the cell wall between bacteria هو أساس ال sub-classification of bacteria into gram positive و gram negative. يعني you all know أخذتوها definitely بالmicrobiology that bacteria stains differently أو خلينا نحكي most of the strains of bacteria stain differently using a gram stain. Okay, واللي هم based على the color they show under the microscope. If it's purple, we call them or we classify them as gram positive. If it will retain the pinkish color, it is gram negative. Okay, such variation with how it is appear or what is the color seen under the microscope when stained with or when stained as with the gram stain. The reason for that اللي هو variation in the cell wall structure. For a gram-positive bacteria, a cell wall somehow is thick. And if you look here, for instance, on which represents a segment of the exterior of a gram-positive cell, on top of the cell membrane, you see a very thick, let's say, piece or segment of the cell wall. That of a gram-negative is different. It's much thinner, like it's way more complicated. Outside the inner cell membrane, it also has, let's say, a peptidoglycan. Okay, well, peptidoglycan polymer is way much thinner versus that seen in a gram-positive bacteria. Okay, on top of that polymer اللي هو peptidoglycan, there is an outer membrane. Okay, يعني بالgram-negative bacteria there are two cell membranes. In between there is a present, let's say, a peptidoglycan polymer. Okay. طيب لما نحكي احنا peptidoglycan, what does this indicate regarding the structure of this polymer? Yes, it is composed of a peptide, which is a polymer of amino acids, and a sugar part. Okay. هلا if you look at this structure in here versus the one where it is zoomed out, those, let's say, circles in here represent the sugar parts that constitute the glycan in the peptidoglycan. And from each, خلينا نحكي, extends polypeptides that are called the stems. Those polypeptides are cross-linked by also peptido, أو خلينا نحكي peptidyl bridges. Okay. Look at the zoomed in structure of the peptidoglycan. Again, the glycan chain is composed of NAG and NAM. We will look at their structures in the next slide. Protruding from the NAM units of the glycan chain comes, let's say, a peptide chain, and that peptide chain, or each of the peptide chains, is linked to another peptide chain in another layer of the glycan chain via a bridge of peptides. Okay. Right. Let's look closer, or before we go into, let's say, a closer look at the exact structures of those peptide stems and the glycan chain. Again, I just want to tell you, أو خلينا نحكي إنه نركز على إنه the building blocks of the peptidoglycan, which are the sugar part with peptide chain, those are synthesized inside the cell. Then they are transported to the outside of the cell, where polymerization of the glycan part and polymerization of the peptide chains, واللي هي in particular بنسميها احنا transpeptidation أو cross-linking, occurs outside of the cell. هلا the enzymes responsible for transglycosylation أو linking أو polymerization the glycans, along with the let's say the cross-linking, which is called the transpeptidation, the enzymes responsible for those two processes for sure are present in the extracellular, let's say, part of the, or in the exterior of cells, which means انهم vulnerable to whatever that can bind to them and inhibit them. هلا الانزيمز responsible for the transpeptidation are called PBP, اختصارا ل penicillin binding proteins. Okay, why they were named that? Because they were discovered following discovery of their inhibitors. يعني we knew about their existence because of the discovery of the inhibitors of those proteins. ليش بنجمعهم احنا? Because it's a family that is composed of different isoforms. Okay? احنا فقط interested with those that do inhibit, oh sorry, that خلينا نحكي do the cross-linking اللي رح نحكي عنه بالlater slides. تمام؟ Again, the NASH and NAM, these are the monomers or building blocks of the glycan chain. NAG stands for N-acetylglucosamine. Yani the structure of this one is simply resembles a glucose, while one of the hydroxyls is substituted with an amine, and that amine is acetylated. It has an acetyl group attached to it. Okay? NAM or N-acetylmuramic acid, very similar to that of NAG, except that it has, let's say, an extra chain that is linked to the hydroxyl on the adjacent carbon. انكم تعرفوا exact structure لهم أكيد لا. يعني just know إنه those are, let's say, derivatives of glucosamine. Now, as in the case of any, let's say, glucose or sugar polymers, these are joined together by glycosidic bond between the hydroxyls on carbon 4 and carbon 1, and beta stands for اللي هي configuration on those hydroxyls on the carbons. Now, this glycan part, protruding from the NAM, is a polypeptide or a stem peptide, okay? That is composed initially before the cross-linking of 5 amino acids. اللي هم A stands for what? Alanine, okay? E, K, yep, and terminal or penultimate and terminal alanine. تمام? Now, linked to the lysines in each of those stem peptides is a glycine bridge, or a peptide that is composed of a glycines of a pentaglycine, أو خلينا نحكي 5 glycine units. This is what is meant by G5. Okay? هلا this bridge is what connects each stem peptide to the other. هلا before the stem peptide is linked, or the glycine bridge from خلينا نحكي stem peptide, let's say 1 to 2, all right? It is linked via the glycine or the pentaglycine to the penultimate alanine. لما نحكي احنا penultimate نقصد فيها الألانين that is, let's say, adjacent to the terminal alanine. Okay? هلا حتى تتكون هاي الأميد باند ما بين الجلايسين bridge and the penultimate alanine, the terminal alanine بتطلع عندي. Okay? And as you can see in here, each stem peptide is linked via a glycine bridge to the, let's say, a lysine in another stem peptide and alanine in the other stem peptide. Okay? This process is what is called the cross-linking, and that's the step that is inhibited by beta-lactams. هلا when inhibited by beta-lactams معناها إنه ال cross-linking ما راح يصير عندي، تمام؟ Which means إنه cell wall structure will not be strong enough, can be, let's say, broken easily, which will expose the bacterial cell to the osmotic pressure, host enzymes, and so on, which would lead probably to lysis of the cell, meaning in beta-lactams are bactericidal or bacteriostatic, tidal for sure. Okay? طيب. Many of those amino acids اللي موجودين عندي are designated with a D letter. Do you know what that stands for? Yeah, أو in other words, the configuration. هلا احنا كلنا بنعرف إنه الأمينو acids طبعا except for glycine are chiral molecules. الألفا carbon is a chiral center, meaning إنه I have 2 possible stereoisomers. All right? هلا بالأمينو acids still we do, let's say, label them as L and D. هلا what is the خلينا نحكي natural amino acid? What is the configuration of natural amino acids? L. Okay? Being in a D configuration in the cell wall structure, do you know, or can you think of the purpose behind that? Or how they were, or why they were created like this? To? Resistance to what? لا. The penicillins, they do not bind to the amino acids of the stem peptide. They bind to the enzymes اللي هم penicillin binding proteins اللي بيعملوا cross linking. هلا أكيد بالسل وبالهوست let's say خلينا نحكي أو بالهوست we يعني البكتيريال cells والhost cells they have for sure peptidases, right? والpeptidases would definitely be specific لمين stereospecific لمين للL. Okay? Being in a D configuration معناها إنه الpeptidases سواء coming from bacteria or that from the host will not lead to the hydrolysis of those amide bonds. Okay? فهي to protect the cell wall from being hydrolyzed by peptidases سواء coming from the bacteria itself or from the host cell. هلا I just want to show you this يعني هيك حتى to imagine what we mean by cross-linking بس هاي كلياتها رح نرجع ونعيدها بشكل مفصل when we talk about the mechanism of البيتا لاكتامز او the mechanism of action of beta lactams in general. Okay. هلا again, let me walk you through, let's say, this figure. This is the glycan chain that is composed of the NAM and NAJ. Okay. And again, transglycosylation is a process that happens exterior or خلينا نحكي extracellularly besides the transpeptidation. هلا simply حكينا انه اللايسين there is a glycine bridge that is composed of 5 amino acids. طبعا هون هو مش represented in that manner, but حتى كمان الجلايسين at the end of that pentapeptide chain there is an amino group. تمام؟ هلا that amino group او خلينا نحكي the other stem peptide that has the alanine, glycine, lysine and the 2 terminal alanines. Okay, what links between the penultimate alanine والalanine والterminal alanine? A peptide bond. Okay, the cross linking ببساطة إنه the enzyme will facilitate okay the amide bond formation ما بين the amino terminal from the pentaglycine bridge with the carbonyl of the penultimate alanine ومقابل هاي الباند اللي راح تتكون راح تطلع عندي التيرمينال alanine. تمام؟ Okay. هلا again, highly process inside the enzyme is more complicated, لكن eventually it leads to the amide formation between the nucleophilic nitrogen and the amide bond. Okay, that links the penultimate to the terminal alanine. هلا how it happens inside the active site of the penicillin binding proteins. يعني الانزيم مش بس انه بيقربهم من بعض وانما كمان بيعمل activation. ببساطة بيكون في عندي inside the active site a serine residue that will attack the amide bond between the penultimate alanine and the terminal alanine, breaking that amide bond. بتطلع عندي ال D, let's say alanine أو terminal alanine. Okay, وبتكون عندي an ester bond ما بين الانزيم and okay the stem peptide of the cell wall أو of the peptide glycan. Now الester versus الامide more electrophilic. اوكي وكانه هالانزيم اللي عمله ببساطه انه عمل activation للاميد باند خلاها more حولها لاستر خلاها more electrophilic which would make it easy for that nitrogen او terminal او خلينا نحكي الامينو terminus to attack that ester وبتتكون عندي هالاميد باند ما بين الكربونيل of the terminal alanine and the nitrogen of the pentaglycine bridge. Don't worry about, let's say, not comprehending this for the time being لأنه رح أرجع وأشرحها بشكل مفصل إن شاء الله المحاضرات اللي جاي. تمام؟ هلا هلا يعني to tell you the truth exactly why it was designed like that and this is God's creation. But this is one way via which you can activate يعني الاميد bonds generally speaking are hard to, let's say, خلينا نحكي hard to break. ف they can be broken easily. يا اما انه لازم يكون في عندي in the active site transition metals اللي ترتبط بالاميد وتعملي لها activation او انها تتحول into an ester واللي هي تعتبر more electrophilic بالتالي more susceptible to attack by the amine. Okay, this is how those enzymes work. They simply convert the amide into an ester which is more reactive, more susceptible to attack by the amine. Okay, هلا في other isoforms of the enzymes in many strains of bacteria بيعتمدوا على وجود, let's say, خلينا نحكي transition metal such as for instance الزنك واللي بيصير hydrolysis للاميد باند بسهولة أو آسفة مش hydrolysis وإنما activation أو البيبتايد formation بدون ما إنه الإنزيم يتفاعل مع الاميد باند ويحولها into, let's say, أو for instance to convert one amide bond into another. Okay. طيب هلا البيتا لاكتامز structurally they highly resemble let's say that amide bond in particular ما بين ال penultimate alanine وال terminal alanine, that is why those enzymes mistakenly bind to them and form a permanent covalent bond that is not broken easily. برضو رح نحكي عنها بشكل مفصل لما نحكي عن ال mechanism of action. Okay, to explain how come that covalent bond is not broken versus that seen in natural substrates. But don't worry if the خلينا نحكي ال image is not well understood here. رح نرجع ونحكي عنها بشكل مفصل later on. So to summarize, the gram-positive bacteria has a much thicker peptidoglycan layers versus that of a gram-negative. It has a much thinner one, لكن it is more complicated, the cell wall overall, because it has an outer membrane. هلا احنا only interested in regarding the gram-negative that it has porins. Those porins, okay, they allow the passage of small molecules that are highly polar. وكان هذا هو الأساس in developing أو in broadening the spectrum of penicillins. يعني first generation أو generations من penicillins, they were effective against the gram-positive, بس لا مش against the gram-negative, لأنه ببساطة they were not able to pass through the cell membrane of the gram-negative bacteria حتى يوصلوا للبيبتايدوغلايكان ويرتبطوا بالpenicillin binding proteins اللي usually راح تكون موجودة عندي in the periplasmic space. Okay? لكن when they added the groups that are ionizable or made the compound highly polar, then these compounds were able to penetrate through the porins to the inside, and they were able to affect the cell wall synthesis أو inhibit the cell wall synthesis بالgram-negative bacteria. برضو رح نحكي عنها بشكل مفصل later on. طيب, any questions so far about the cell wall structure? رح نبلش هلا نحكي عن البيتا لاكتامز structure wise, the chemistry for them versus خلينا نحكي يعني احنا صح بنحكي عنهم البيتا لاكتامز in general, لكن هم relative to a beta lactam alone, they are very which do not have, let's say, antibacterial activity. Those classes of the beta lactam drugs, they have in them instilled structural variations that does lead to their binding to the enzymes and their inhibition of the enzymes. هلا لما احكي beta lactam, what does that mean? أو structure wise زي ما هو مرسوم عندكم. When I say lactam to begin with, cyclic amide, okay? هلا depending على إنه covalent bond مكونة بين النيتروجين و which carbon, okay? This is illustrated by that prefix. All right? هلا كلكم تعرفوا إنه for any carbonyl, بغض النظر carboxylic acid, ketone, aldehyde, amide, whatever the derivative of the carboxylic acid is, the carbon that is adjacent to the carbonyl carbon is designated a letter alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and so on. Okay? فdepending على البond ما بين النيتروجين of the amide to which carbon it is connected to, then we use, let's say, this letter to designate, or in other words, to illustrate a ring size of that lactam. When the bond is between a beta carbon and the nitrogen, this is when we call it a beta lactam, okay? Which is four-membered. هلا a newer, let's say, naming for البيتا lactam اللي هو الازيتيدينون, which is derived from azitidine, that is composed of a four-membered ring where one of its atoms is a nitrogen. And when you add a carbonyl to it, that's when an azitidine with a carbonyl or oxo becomes azitidinone. The subclasses of the beta-lactam antibiotics اللي رح نحكي عنهم penicillins, cephalosporins, beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitors, monobactams, and carbaminops. Okay? هلا when the antibiotic has only one ring structure, which is only the beta-lactam, طبعا this is not enough at all إنه يرتبط, بس يعني core ring structure is that of a beta-lactam. This is when we call it a monobactam. In other subclasses, have a ring that is fused to the beta-lactam. Okay? When it's a thiazolidine ring, as you can see in here, this ring structure is called pinam. هلا إذا موجود عندكم بالسلايدز still هاي الاي باك نيمينج يعني إطلاقا don't worry about it أكيد مش مطلوب منكم تحفظوها. All you need to know إنه البينام is where you have a beta-lactam that is attached or as fused with a thiazolidine ring, which represents the core structure seen in all penicillins. Okay? When a six-membered ring that is attached to a beta-lactam, this core ring is called cephem. That is the pharmacophore seen in all cephalosporins. طيب penem versus penem. إيش الاختلاف بالستركتشر بينهم؟ Yeah, and we have a double bond between carbons 2 and 3. Thus, they've changed the am with an E to indicate a double bond. طيب, carbapenem versus penem and pinam. Yeah, when you substitute the sulfur with a carbon, then it is carbapenem. So if you, let's say, memorize the structure of the pinam and cephem, you can easily identify what would the penem structure would be and what would carbapenem structure be. Okay? طيب, هلا in terms of numbering, which is also very important for us, إنه دائما الترقيم ببلش من النيتروجين. In all of those ring systems, دائما بيكون عندي numbering starts from the nitrogen. هلا في حالة المونوباكتام, it's the beta carbon that is designated number 2. The rest of the rings, okay, what comes next after a nitrogen, which is the carbon that is adjacent to the nitrogen in the fused ring, this one is the one that is designated number 2 وبنكمل منها. Okay. طيب, نحكي هلا عن الchemistry of the pinam. So we will start with penicillins first, and we need to talk about the chemistry of the pinam ring and penicillins. What is this compound? What is it called? Cyclobutane, okay? طيب, when you substitute one of the carbons with a nitrogen, هلا حكينا اسمها azitidine. طيب, what is the hybridization of the nitrogen in azitidine? sp3 بالضبط. It is sp3. Okay, this is the nitrogen, the carbons that are attached to it, and the hydrogen. And what about this thing in pink? What do you think it? هي الهيدروجين already. Lone pair. Okay, so that pinkish, let's say, small ball stands for the lone pair. بس هو يعني صراحة الأوربيتال اللي يفترض يكون موجود فيه اللون pair بيكون way much bigger than actually the molecular orbital between the carbon and nitrogen, أو as the nitrogen will hydrogen will nitrogen will carbon. Anyway, when you have a double bond in here, or a carbonyl adjacent to the nitrogen, this is a beta-lactam now, all right? Like, considering the 3D structure of this beta-lactam, what is the hybridization? Look at the geometries of the atoms. What is the hybridization of the nitrogen and the carbonyl carbon? sp2, okay? واضح إنه كل هاي الatoms, الأكسجين, الكربون, the carbon adjacent to the carbonyl carbon, النيتروجين, الcarbon that is adjacent to it, الهيدروجين اللي موجود عندي على النيتروجين, all of them are planar. The hybridization is sp2, all right? والlone pair اللي مش مبين هون موجود in which orbital? In a p orbital, okay? هلا, the lone pair that is present in a p orbital definitely will be parallel to the p orbitals that hold the pi electrons. بما إنه كلياتهم parallel to each other, yes. لا بتكون يعني هي ما بتكون يعني بجوز something احنا ما ناقش او ما تناقش بالاورجانيك. هو ما بيكون لا sp2 ولا sp3 something in between. كل orbitals deviated يعني usually ما بيكون عندك البونز head to head overlap. يعني صح مرسومة وكأنه الزاوية على سبيل المثال ما بين هاي الكربون وهاي الكربون 90 بس this is not the case. بتكون عندي الاوربيتالز it's not head to head overlap بيكون عندي هيك slightly let's say deviated يعني وكأنه الباند هيك بيكون شكلها. alright ف يعني حتى بهال 3D structure شوية مش كثير accurate يعني شوي بيكون في عندي deviation بالباندز ما بتكون let's say خلينا نحكي الالكترونز موجودين على نفس اللاين ما بين التو كاربونز بيكون شوية في deviation. فهلا الهايبرديزيشن of those carbons صح هم بيكونوا بلانر مع الكربونيل كاربون والنيتروجين بس ما بيكون الهايبرديزيشن لإلهم sp3 entirely ولا sp2 entirely بيكون something in between. إشي إحنا بجوز ما حكيناش عنه أو ما نحكى عنه بالأورجانيك كورس ويوجوالي حتى كمان يعني إذا بدنا نحكي عنه بنحكي عنه بالأدفانس كورسز يعني. But for خلينا نحكي this course أو this part in particular about the hybridization consider those carbons in here the hybridization لإلهم sp3 مش sp2. طيب بما إنه the p orbital of this nitrogen and p orbitals of this carbonyl are all let's say parallel to each other معناها إنه في عندي resonance و there is let's say delocalization between them. okay which means إنه هاي النيتروجين الموجودة عندي هون is it basic؟ لا okay لأنه electrons of this nitrogen are highly withdrawn inductively and via resonance from this carbonyl. okay طيب هلا if you would compare it to this compound the carbon in here طبعا احنا بنعرف انه كل الكربونيل carbons okay yeah what I mean انهم they are electrophilic all right and the reason for that انه انا في عندي oxygens عم تسحب electrons منهم all right طيب ما بين let's say this structure where I have only a carbonyl أو خلينا نحكي a cyclic ketone versus البيتا لاكتام مين أو which of those carbons is more electrophilic؟ مين more electrophilic؟ yeah ليش؟ true لكن بالضبط هلا consider when you let's say need to discuss this consider إنه صح أنا عندي النيتروجين عم تسحب electrons inductively but at the same time it's donating electrons via resonance to this carbon. والnet result أو خلينا نحكي المور profound effect إنه النيتروجين أو الأميدز versus الكيتونز are less electrophilic. They are not nucleophilic. They are electrophilic. The carbonyl carbon of amides are less electrophilic than that of a ketone. Okay? Tamam? All right. Now let's look at when we have a fused ring to the beta-lactam. In the case of the penicillins that have a penam ring, where we have a thiazolidine ring that is fused to the beta-lactam. Look at the 3D structure of this compound. The nitrogen here, does it look like it's sp2 hybridized? Right. هلا انت ما بتاخذيها هي والكربون انت you consider الاتاتشمنتس اللي عليها do they look on the same they are on يعني هل هاي الكربون وهاي الكربون وهاي الكربون هل كلياتهم على نفس البلين؟ لا انا مش شايفتهم على نفس البلين. yeah so هلا الجيومتري يعني when you fuse this ring حتى انها تكون let's say planar معناها راح يكون في عندي deviation جدا جدا عالي بالانجل let's say او بالبوند يعني البوند angles on the nitrogen ومش بس البوند angles كمان والبوند lengths. because of that this compound the most stable geometry له إنه النيتروجين ما تكون عندي الاتاتشمنتس اللي عليها كلياتهم على نفس البلين. Alright, look at this other structure in here. Here the nitrogen as you can see الاتاتشمنتس اللي عليها مش على نفس البلين. This carbonyl carbon وهاي الكربون اللي موجودة عندي هون they are not on the same plane, which means إنه hybridization for sure is not sp2 hybridized. The lone pair of electrons in the nitrogen ما رح يكون in a p orbital that is parallel to the p orbitals of the pi bond. بما إنهم not parallel, yeah, there is almost inefficient أو إنه رح يكون على الأغلب الدونيشن جدا 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 ضعيف. The delocalization of this lone pair along with the electrons of the pi bond almost let's say not present. ما رح يكون موجود عندي. Let's say such a resonance or such electron donation to the pi bond. طيب, how this would affect the partial positive charge على الكربونيل carbon versus that of a beta-lactam that is not fused with any ring. يصير عندي way more electrophilic لأنه هلا النيتروجين it's not donating electrons anymore to the carbonyl carbon. It only withdrawing electrons inductively. Okay, فالpartial positive charge على هاي الكربونيل carbon بتزيد عندي بشكل كبير. لأنه ال lone pair are no longer present in a p orbital that is parallel to the p orbitals of the pi bond. لأنه geometry is dictating that. Geometry is where, let's say, or what is deviating that orbital from the p orbitals of the pi bond on the carbonyl أو in the carbonyl. يعني سوري هنا إنه هم مرسومين مش زي كأنهم p orbitals، مرسومين وكأنهم sp، بس للأسف بالكم درو اللي رسمت فيه الستركتشرز ما فيهم representation ال p orbitals، ف that is why. عفوا. هلا راح يكون هو هن مش راح يكونوا in a p orbital، راح يكونوا in an orbital، يعني هو behind that carbon behind that nitrogen اسف. يعني لو انا يعني تخيل this is the nitrogen راح يكون ال p orbital بهاي الزاوية بس يعني I cannot draw it let's say يعني بشكل دقيق، بس هو راح يكون هالorbital behind that let's say that nitrogen. لو أنا عملت له rotation شوية يعني to the left or to خلينا نحكي to the left راح يكون وكأنه عندي موجود هون. Okay, it will not be parallel to the p orbitals of the carbonyl. So that is why, because of the lack of the donation of electrons via resonance from the nitrogen, the partial positive charge on this carbonyl carbon will increase. The electrophilicity will increase for sure. The susceptibility of this carbonyl carbon, أو خلينا نحكي of this bond to be broken. Yeah. The reactivity with the nucleophiles راح تكون أكثر. فعشان هيك البيتا لاكتام in a pinam versus that of a beta lactam that is not fused to anything, it is more susceptible to hydrolysis على سبيل المثال due to acidic and basic conditions. Okay, وبرضه كمان رح نحكي عنها بالتفصيل المحاضرة اللي جاي. Alright. طيب. هلا النيتروجينز in amides are they basic? Simply because the lone pair is not localized. It's highly withdrawn inductively and via resonance by the carbonyl. لكن in here in pinams it's more basic. Okay, لو أخذت أنا البينام والبيتا لاكتام حطيتهم في acidic conditions، لو افترضنا مثلا pH تقريبا 10-11 راح يصير في عندي protonation to the nitrogen of the pinam but not this one. Okay, for this nitrogen I don't have an exact let's say value for it. ما قرأتش صراحة إنه it was measured، بس مثلا it was studied أو الهيدروليسيس was studied أو مش الهيدروليسيس for البنسلينز was studied بالبيسك conditions. لما تحطيهم في pH تقريبا 12 بصير لهم بروتونيشن سريع، يعني within an hour الكمباوند بصير له هيدروليسيس، لانه ببساطه سوري انا عم بحكي 12 سوري بالاسيدك كونديشنز، يعني لما تحكي عن pH 2 ان سوري pH let's say around 2 3 بصير بروتونيشن وبنسبه عاليه to that nitrogen، بصير hydrolysis للكمباوند within an hour you will lose sight of this you cannot or you will not let's say detect it، بصير له hydrolysis سريع. يس يعني ممكن تكون around 9 ويعني I would expect let's say around 8 and 9 something like that، إشي similar للأليفاتيك amines. يس هلا الكاربينيل بتسحب لا بالعكس ممكن تكون أعلى شوي من الأليفاتيك كاربونز، لأنه أنت عندك كاربينيل عم تسحب inductively من النيتروجين. yeah. لا بالعكس لما تسحب آسفة sorry yes yeah it will be slightly lower than 8 and 9. yep you are right. سوري خربطت لكم اليوم الاسيدز والبيسز مع بعض، اسفه. طيب let me summarize على اساس انه if I confused you I will let's say خلينا نحكي نشيل any confusion. The partial positive charge of this carbonyl carbon relative in a pinam versus that of a let's say a lactam, a beta lactam, the partial positive charge is higher, the electrophilicity is much higher, simply because the lone pair is no longer in a p orbital that is parallel to these orbitals, okay, or to the p orbitals of the pi bond. But there is no electron donation, okay? Halla, in terms of the basicity, this nitrogen versus that of a beta lactam is more basic, simply because the lone pair is almost localized on that nitrogen, okay? So that is why this nitrogen can be somehow easily protonated in acidic conditions. Okay? So, another perspective via which we can explain إنه ما بصير في عندي resonance besides اللي هي إنه geometry dictates إنه orbitals are not parallel to each other. إنه if we would think about if resonance is to happen, what is the structure or how much the stability is for the other resonance structure. يعني لو افترضت إنه أنا صار في عندي resonance donation and this is the other resonance form drone, okay, where the nitrogen here will be sp2 hybridized, okay. What is the bond angles in between a خلينا نحكي يعني for this structure in here? What would be the bond or what should be the bond angle for this nitrogen in here? 120. Bond angles in an sp2 hybridized atom 120. Here it's around 90. يعني راح يكون في عندي very high deviation that is happening along إنه راح يكون في عندي not only from this bond but راح يكون في عندي deviation عالي ما بين النيتروجين والثيازوليدين ring. البonds ما بين this أو let's say in the thiazolidine ring itself. For this high angle strain and high ring strain resulting from that would make this structure impossibly strained. فحتى لو لو افترضنا إنه بده يتكون، okay, راح تكون let's say the likelihood for its formation is very minimal, the contribution is very minimal. فعشان هيك we almost consider إنه nitrogen in pinam ring, for instance, does not donate electrons to the carbonyl via resonance. بس a few let's say slides and we'll be done. Sorry إني أنا تأخرت عليكم. هلا before we go into the first natural amino acids that natural penicillins that were isolated, يعني هيك حبيت أفرجيكم ال images of the خلينا نحكي البيبر اللي نشروا فيها أول مرة عن البنسلينز discovery. يعني كلكم أكيد سمعتوا أنتوا صغار the story of Fleming discovery of penicillins. By the way, يعتبر هالدiscovery it's يعني a very very major discovery that changed the course of life for humans خلينا نحكي in history. يعني مثال رائع Fleming's discovery على إنه chance. يعني you definitely heard that saying before إنه chance discovery favors prepared mind. يعني حتى الأشياء اللي تكتشف بالصدفة, okay, it needs, let's say, someone who is intrigued by outliers, intrigued by إنه to be curious, إنه to explain what happens here. اللي صار مع فليمنج ببساطة إنه كان let's say incubating bacteria على agar plate, okay. هلا صار في contamination, يعني those agar plates were contaminated by the fungi, okay. لو بجوز حدا ثاني كان مسك الagar plate وكبه, but for him when he noticed إنه حوالين الcolony of the fungi ما في any bacterial growth, معناها definitely هالfungi is, let's say, producing something that is killing bacteria. And from that point, when he published that work, صح, it took a lot of time for others, let's say, to comprehend his discovery later on يفصلوا البنسلينز. يعني هو أول paper نشرها كانت بسنة 29, أوكي. للأسف ما وصلوا إنهم to isolate enough penicillin to treat one patient إلا بالأربعينات يعني. فبس هيك حبيت أفرجيكم البيبر اللي نشر فيها his discovery with this image of the actual agar plate that he actually, from which he hypothesized إنه this fungi is producing an antibacterial agent. Okay. طيب هلا الناتشورال penicillins اللي بجوز مر عليكم بالفارماكولوجي. Do you know their names? Penicillin G, Penicillin V. There are also other natural penicillins, but those are the main ones that were isolated first. Okay. هلا you definitely know إنه penicillins actually are synthesized from 3 amino acids اللي هم cysteine, valine, and amino adipic acid. All right. هلا الfungi simply it condenses those amino acids to give rise to what is known as isopenicillin N. والisopenicillin N, okay, later on from carboxylic acid derivatives, الfungi اللي بتعمله إنه it replaces the side chain in isopenicillin N with that carboxylic acid derivative to give rise, which gave rise eventually to penicillin G and penicillin V. تمام؟ هلا that side chain في penicillin V و penicillin G اللي فيه, let's say, this side chain, those actually comes from acetic acid derivatives اللي ضافوها على الميديا. It's not something that الfungi makes itself. when they discovered that بأول penicillin that was isolated اللي هو البنسلين G, صاروا غيروا الكربوكسيليك acids اللي بتنضاف على الgrowth media of the fungi, ومنها طلع معاهم penicillin V و later on O and N and so on. Okay, depending على يعني what I'm saying إنه the structure of the penicillin is derived from those 3 amino acids, لكن the side chain that is seen in penicillin V and penicillin G actually comes from an additive to the fungi growth media. Okay? Lacking still, we do consider G or V natural penicillins because they are entirely synthesized by fungi. هلا the precursor from which, let's say, we can rely on to vary the penicillins اللي هو 6 amino penicillinic acid, 6 because if you remember, okay, that's the numbering of the penam ring. In على carbon number 6, the amino group in here stands for الامينو penicillinic acid. تمام؟ 6 amino penicillinic acid itself has low antibacterial activity. يعني ممكن يرتبط في البنسلين binding proteins بس ما بتكون binding affinity جدا عالية. Okay? لكن when you have a side chain that is attached to that amino group in the form of an amide, okay, or in the form of an acyl group, this is when the binding affinity will become way much higher. The availability of 6 amino penicillinic acid and then reacting it with the proper acyl group is what allowed for the great variation in the structures of penicillins. All right? So those derivatives, ampicillin, amoxicillin, methicillin, هل نعتبرهم إحنا natural penicillins؟ بما إنه part of it comes from nature and the other part, yeah, these are actually semi-synthetic compounds. طيب، آخر شيء بدي أحكي عنه اللي هي إنه we have an ionizable group in here. This carboxylic acid is an ionizable group. The pK لها تقريبا around 4, which means that at physiological pH it can be ionized. And also, because it's, let's say, an ionizable group, we can prepare salts out of it. All right? هلا السولت أو الكانتر ion بالسولت dictates إنه أنا ممكن أزيد البولاريتي أو أقللها. All right? Yep. هلا for instance, if you prepare a sodium salt, for instance, or a calcium salt, or potassium salt out of this free acid, okay, their solubility will be higher than the free acid or the parent acid. But if you attach, let's say, such counter ions, or if you react the free acid with benzathine or procaine على سبيل المثال, yeah, that counter ion will definitely decrease, as you can see, the solubility of that salt. All right? طيب هلا for instance على سبيل المثال الصوديوم salt بسهوله كيف بيتحضر؟ ممكن اضيف let's say hypothetically بضيف مثلا HCl على let's say the free acid based reaction giving rise to water, and sodium will now let's say have an ionic interaction with the carboxylate. طب what about the benzathine? If you add it to the free acid of the penicillin, not سوري أنا حكيت ضفنا HCl it's not NaOH آسفة again. اليوم عندي معلوماتي بالأسيدز والبيسز معكوسة تماما. هلا if you add benzathine to carboxylic acid, what do you think happens? Yeah, look at the benzathine structure. Is it an acidic compound or a basic compound? Basic. Where is the basic atom? Both of the nitrogens in here. So if you add it to the free acid, simply that nitrogen will abstract the proton of the carboxylic acid, becomes positively charged, and the carboxylate now, which will be negatively charged, and then an ionic interaction between them, all right, which is not easily broken, and the overall, let's say, polarity of the salt versus that of the free acid will become less. Same thing for procaine, okay? Which nitrogen is the one that will obstruct the proton of the carboxylic acid? That tertiary nitrogen, okay? هلا البنزاثين, since it has two basic centers, the benzathine molecule can form, let's say, salts, or it can, let's say, bond to, via طبعا for sure ionic bonds with two molecules of the penicillin. All right? طيب. So we'll finish here. والمحاضرة الجاية إن شاء الله راح تكون an explanation of the reactivity, instability and acidic and basic conditions, وبرضه كمان راح نبلش نحكي عن structural activity relationship. يعطيكم ألف عافية يا جماعة. Hold on a second.